snow, steel, and silence. In a frozen valley carved from rust and ice, 10,000 Mongol riders pushed forward, relentless, without mercy. Standing against them were merely 100 Vikings, the final Varangians of the frozen north. No fortifications, no route of escape, only the resolve to hold their ground. How could 100 Vikings halt 10,000 Mongol invaders? Welcome back to Echoes of Past, where history flows through steel and myth. Hit like, subscribe, and step into the snow, where 100 warriors etch their names into history. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol war machine had evolved into the most devastating and fearsome military force the world had witnessed. Under Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan himself, the Golden Horde tore through the Rus principalities with flame and deadly precision. Entire cities, Ryazan, Vladimir, and Kiev, collapsed within weeks, their timber walls offering no resistance to the mobility and discipline of Mongol cavalry. In this storm of conquest, one of history's most peculiar encounters took shape. Not between kingdoms or empires, but between two warrior traditions separated by generations. Along the frozen valleys of northern Rus, remnants of the ancient Varangian Guard, the famed Norse mercenaries who had once protected Byzantine emperors, still remained in service to regional princes. Descendants of the Vikings who had navigated the rivers of the East during the 9th and 10th centuries. These warriors had long left their Scandinavian homelands behind, but never their warrior code. The Mongols, by contrast, embodied the future of warfare. Each unit functioned independently, yet moved as part of a greater whole. Light cavalry archers formed the core of their strength, men capable of releasing 6 arrows per minute while riding at full gallop, transforming retreat into ambush and disorder into calculated trap. Against them, the heavy infantry of Europe, slow, inflexible, and reliant on defensive formations, seldom survived direct engagement. By 1240, most of Rus lay under Mongol tribute. Yet in remote valleys and river settlements, scattered bands of fighters, local militias, Cuman remnants, and Varangian mercenaries continued their resistance. These skirmishes, minor and often lost to memory, formed the undercurrent of a greater struggle, the final death throes of the old Norse-Rus martial culture before it disappeared beneath Mongol supremacy. One such confrontation occurred along an unnamed tributary of the Volga, somewhere between the forests of Murom and the marshes of the Upper Kama. Archaeological surveys and later chronicles reference a Valley of Shields, where a small Rus detachment, reportedly no more than 100 Varangian mercenaries, was intercepted by a pursuing Mongol force numbering in the thousands. The event might have vanished entirely from memory, if not for the sheer impossibility of its outcome. There, on a strip of ice and frozen mud no wider than a breath, the old world collided with the new. The last sons of Odin facing the descendants of Genghis, the Mongol vanguard appeared before dawn. A thin mist drifted over the frozen river, dampening sound and obscuring movement. Scouts reported a handful of survivors fleeing along the valley. Batu Khan's sub-commander issued a straightforward order: surround and annihilate. But as the sun pierced through the fog, the steppe horsemen discovered something unanticipated. At the valley's entrance, between the ice-locked river and a low ridge, a wall of shields gleamed faintly in the morning light. 100 men stood shoulder to shoulder, round shields overlapping like scales of iron. Behind them, wooden stakes and sleds had been hammered into the frozen earth, forming a rough palisade. There were no fleeing survivors. They had selected their ground, and they were waiting. The Varangians understood terrain the way sailors understood the wind. They had fought in Byzantine mountain passes and in Rus forests long before the Mongols were a whisper on the steppe. Here they had located a choke point where cavalry couldn't flank them, and where the snowdrifts turned horses into burdens. The frozen river to their left and thick woodland to their right created a natural bottleneck, forcing the enemy to attack head-on. The Mongols began, as they always did, with the bow. Waves of light cavalry spread out, releasing arrows in graceful arcs. The sky dimmed briefly, then filled with a whisper of death. Yet when the dust cleared, the shield wall remained standing. The Varangians had crouched behind overlapping shields, their cloaks rigid with frost, but their discipline intact. The curved Mongol arrows, fired from distance, struck at deflecting angles, embedding themselves uselessly in the snow or shattering against iron rims. Realizing the barrage was futile, the Mongols pressed closer. They fired while galloping, then pretended to retreat, hoping to lure pursuit, an ancient steppe trick. But the Varangians remained motionless. They stayed planted, silent, allowing the Mongols to exhaust arrows and energy against wood and determination. Frustration mounted among the Mongol ranks. Their commanders called for a charge. Hundreds of riders stormed forward, lances leveled, certain that shock would shatter the static wall. But the frozen ground betrayed them. Horses skidded on ice. Spears splintered against shields. When the first riders reached the line, the Vikings surged forward as one. Axes rose and descended in a rhythm of violence older than empires. The impact was devastating. Horses shrieked, men tumbled, and the snow turned scarlet. The Mongols withdrew, reorganized, and circled to probe for weakness. They tried fire arrows next, hoping to burn the defenders alive, but the wet snow extinguished the flames, and the Varangians only compressed their formation. Each time the Mongols approached, a tempest of axes and spears greeted them. The Norsemen fought not as individuals, but as a breathing wall, each shield protecting his brother's side. By midday, the valley had transformed into a graveyard of broken steeds and splintered shafts. The Mongols were unaccustomed to such defiance from so few. Psychological warfare, drums, whistles, and false retreats failed to unsettle the defenders. Instead, it was the horsemen who began to feel the creeping burden of exhaustion and dread. Mongol doctrine depended on mobility and open space. In the valley, they possessed neither. Their archery superiority diminished. Their coordination wavered. Every charge constricted the battlefield further, pushing riders into a killing zone. The Varangians capitalized on this, advancing between attacks to drag down injured horses and scavenge usable weapons, converting Mongol spears into improvised pikes. As the pale sun descended behind the ridge, the Mongol commander paused. Hours of assault had produced nothing but frozen corpses and wounded pride. Night would soon transform the valley into ice and death. To continue was lunacy. To retreat was disgrace. At last, the horn blared. The horsemen pulled back in somber silence, abandoning their dead and their disbelief. By the following morning, the valley was quiet once more. Smoke rose from Viking fires as they cremated their fallen, marking the snow with the black scent of sacrifice. Their stand would never be recorded in official Mongol chronicles. Such defeats were beneath documentation, but in local legend, whispered by hunters and chroniclers of Rus, the tale persisted. The day 100 men stopped 10,000. To historians, this encounter symbolizes the twilight of the Viking martial spirit, out of place in time, yet undefeated in will. This battle wasn't simply about numbers or tactics. It represented something deeper, a collision between two philosophies of warfare. The Mongols mastered speed, flexibility, and the devastating power of ranged combat. They had conquered empires by refusing to fight on anyone else's terms. But here, in this narrow valley, they were forced to abandon everything that made them invincible. The Varangians, meanwhile, embodied an older tradition. They were the inheritors of a culture that valued the shield wall above all else, a formation that required absolute trust, unflinching courage, and the willingness to die standing rather than live fleeing. For these men, there was no tactical retreat, no clever maneuver. There was only the line and the conviction that the line must hold. What made this stand particularly extraordinary was the complete absence of reinforcements or hope of rescue. The Varangians knew they were alone. They knew the Mongols could simply wait them out, starve them into submission, or call for additional forces. Yet they chose to fight anyway, transforming what should have been a massacre into something resembling a miracle. The terrain was their greatest ally, but terrain alone doesn't win battles. The frozen valley amplified their strengths and neutralized Mongol advantages, but it still required superhuman endurance to maintain that shield wall for hours, while arrows fell like rain and cavalry charges hammered against their formation again and again. Consider the physical toll. These men fought in sub-zero temperatures, wearing armor that provided protection but also trapped cold against their skin. They stood for hours without breaking formation, without food or water, watching their comrades fall one by one. The psychological pressure must have been immense, knowing that a single break in the line could cascade into total collapse. Yet they held. When horses charged, they braced and absorbed the impact. When arrows fell, they raised shields and endured. When Mongol warriors broke through the initial line, they were met not with panic, but with axes wielded by men who had trained for exactly this kind of close-quarters brutality. The Mongol perspective on this battle is equally fascinating. For warriors who had toppled kingdoms and shattered armies 10 times larger than this small band, the valley must have felt like a nightmare. Every tactic that had worked across thousands of miles suddenly proved useless. Their mobility meant nothing in the narrow pass. Their superior numbers couldn't be brought to bear effectively. Even their legendary discipline and coordination faltered against an enemy that simply refused to move. Imagine the frustration of Mongol commanders, men accustomed to victories so complete that enemies often surrendered at the mere sight of their approach. Here they were, unable to dislodge 100 freezing, exhausted Norsemen from a strip of frozen mud. The cognitive dissonance must have been staggering. As the day wore on, something else happened, something that rarely occurs in military history. The Mongols began to doubt, not doubt in their overall superiority or their eventual victory in the larger war, but doubt in whether this particular fight was worth the cost. Every charge cost them men and horses. Every failed volley wasted precious arrows. And for what? To eliminate a force so small it posed no strategic threat. This is where the true genius of the Varangian position reveals itself. They didn't need to defeat 10,000 Mongols. They only needed to make the cost of defeating them exceed the value of victory. In military terms, they made themselves more expensive to destroy than they were worth destroying. When the Mongol horn finally sounded retreat, it wasn't because they couldn't eventually overwhelm the defenders. Given enough time, enough arrows, enough waves of cavalry, they undoubtedly could have. But at what cost? And more importantly, why? The Golden Horde had entire principalities to conquer. Wasting resources on a meaningless valley made no tactical sense. So they withdrew, leaving behind a field of their dead and, perhaps more importantly, leaving behind a story. Stories are powerful things, especially in medieval warfare. Word of this stand would have spread through Rus like wildfire. Every resistance fighter, every local militia, every prince still clinging to independence would have heard about the day 100 men stopped the unstoppable. The psychological impact of such stories shouldn't be underestimated. The Mongols relied heavily on their reputation. Cities often surrendered without a fight, simply because they knew resistance was futile. But here was proof that it wasn't always futile. Here was evidence that with the right ground, the right tactics, and the right spirit, even the mighty Mongols could be denied. Of course, this single battle changed nothing about the broader Mongol conquest. Rus still fell. The Golden Horde still established dominance. These 100 Varangians, whether they survived the night or died of their wounds in the following days, couldn't alter the trajectory of history. But they didn't need to. What they did was preserve something intangible but vitally important. The idea that courage matters, that skill matters, that determination can sometimes triumph over overwhelming odds. They became a symbol of resistance in an age that desperately needed such symbols. The archaeological evidence for this battle is frustratingly sparse, as is true for many medieval conflicts. We have no mass graves clearly attributable to this engagement, no battlefield clearly marked by historians. What we have are fragments, references in chronicles, local legends passed down through generations, and the occasional artifact that suggests significant combat occurred in the region during this period. Some historians question whether the battle happened at all, or at least whether it happened as described. Could 100 men really hold off thousands? The skeptics have valid points. Medieval chronicles are notorious for exaggerating numbers and glorifying defeats into moral victories. The 10,000 Mongols might have been 1,000 or even fewer. But even if we adjust the numbers significantly, the core truth remains compelling. A small force of Varangian mercenaries, cut off from support, chose to make a stand in a frozen valley. They selected terrain that neutralized enemy advantages. They held their formation under intense pressure. And they inflicted enough casualties that the Mongols decided to withdraw rather than pay the price of total victory. That's extraordinary, regardless of the exact numbers involved. It speaks to a level of tactical sophistication, personal courage, and group cohesion that defines elite military units across all of history. These were professionals at the absolute peak of their craft, facing an enemy equally professional and equally deadly. The broader historical context makes this encounter even more poignant. By 1240, the age of the Vikings was effectively over. The last great Viking raids had occurred generations earlier. Scandinavian kingdoms had converted to Christianity and were becoming integrated into European feudal structures. The wild seafaring warriors who had terrorized Europe for centuries were fading into memory. But here, in the frozen valleys of Rus, their descendants endured. The Varangian Guard had long since ceased to be primarily Scandinavian. By this point, they recruited from various backgrounds, but they maintained the traditions and fighting styles of their Norse founders. They were living links to a vanishing past, practitioners of a military art that was becoming obsolete. Against them stood the future. The Mongol way of war would dominate Eurasian military thinking for centuries. Their emphasis on mobility, combined arms, and psychological warfare influenced military development from China to Eastern Europe. They represented modernity, efficiency, and ruthless pragmatism. So this wasn't just a battle between two armies. It was a battle between eras, between philosophies, between ways of understanding warfare and honor and death. The Varangians knew they were fighting for a dying culture. They knew that even if they survived this day, the world they had known was disappearing. Perhaps that's why they fought with such ferocity, not just for survival, but for memory, for the preservation of something precious that was slipping away. The Mongol withdrawal from the valley would have been conducted with characteristic discipline. Despite the setback, they maintained formation, collected what wounded they could reach, and departed in good order. There would have been no panic, no rout. These were professionals acknowledging a tactical stalemate, not a defeated army fleeing in terror. For the Varangians, the aftermath would have been bittersweet. They had survived, which was itself remarkable. They had proven that the Mongols weren't invincible, which was valuable. But they were still trapped in hostile territory, still cut off from allies, still facing an empire that could afford to lose 1,000 men in a meaningless valley without blinking. Their victory, if we can call it that, was purely defensive. They had held a position for one day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. The Mongols might return with different tactics or simply bypass the valley entirely, leaving the defenders to slowly freeze or starve. The strategic situation hadn't changed at all, yet something had changed, something immeasurable but real. Those 100 men had looked at impossible odds and chosen defiance. They had transformed certain death into unlikely survival through skill, courage, and brotherhood. They had reminded the world that numbers aren't everything, that terrain and tactics and sheer bloody-minded determination can sometimes overcome material superiority. In the grand sweep of history, this battle is a footnote, a minor skirmish in a vast campaign of conquest. But for those who study military history, who appreciate the art of war in all its terrible beauty, this encounter shines like a beacon. It exemplifies everything that makes small unit actions so fascinating. The human element amplified, individual decisions carrying enormous weight, skill, and courage, mattering more than logistics and numbers. The valley itself would have been a haunting place in the days following the battle. The snow, pristine and white in the morning, now stained with blood and littered with the debris of combat. Broken arrows protruding from drifts like strange flowers. Dead horses frozen in contorted positions. The shields that had held so long now splintered and bent, still marking the line where 100 men decided that here and no further the Mongols would not pass. As word of the stand spread through Rus, it would have been embellished and mythologized. The 100 would become 50, then 30, making the feat seem even more impossible. The 10,000 Mongols might become 20,000 in some tellings. Supernatural elements might be added, divine intervention, prophetic dreams, magical weapons. This is how legends are born, from kernels of historical truth wrapped in layers of storytelling and cultural memory. But beneath the legend lies a truth that needs no embellishment. A group of professional warriors, descendants of Vikings, the last Varangians of the North, made a stand against overwhelming odds. They chose their ground wisely. They fought with discipline and courage, and for one frozen day in a forgotten valley, they proved that the old ways could still prevail against the new. The Mongols would go on to conquer vast territories, establishing an empire that stretched from China to Eastern Europe. The Golden Horde would rule Rus for centuries, extracting tribute and shaping the region's development in profound ways. The Varangian tradition would fade entirely, eventually disappearing into the pages of history books. But in that valley, for those few hours, none of that mattered. What mattered was the shield wall, the discipline, the brotherhood of warriors who had decided to stand together. What mattered was the choice to fight rather than flee, to die with honor rather than live in shame. This is why the story endures, passed down through centuries, inspiring warriors and historians, and anyone who believes that courage and skill can sometimes overcome impossible odds. It reminds us that history isn't just made by kings and emperors, by grand strategies and massive armies. Sometimes it's made by 100 men in a frozen valley, holding a line against the darkness, refusing to yield, writing their names in blood and ice into the eternal memory of those who remember that courage, above all, is what defines us in our darkest hours. The formation of the shield wall itself deserves deeper examination. This wasn't simply men standing next to each other with shields raised. It was a sophisticated tactical formation that had been refined over centuries of Norse warfare. Each warrior positioned his shield to overlap with his neighbor's, creating a continuous barrier that was far stronger than the sum of its parts. The front rank bore the brunt of attacks, while warriors in the second and third ranks could thrust spears over and between the shields, creating a deadly hedge that horses and men alike struggled to penetrate. The psychological aspect of maintaining a shield wall cannot be overstated. It requires absolute trust in the men beside you. If one warrior breaks or falls back, the entire formation becomes vulnerable. The Varangians in that valley knew this intimately. They had trained together, fought together, and now they would stand together or die together. There was no individual glory in the shield wall, only collective survival. The selection of the valley as their defensive position reveals military thinking of the highest caliber. These weren't desperate men making a last stand in whatever location they happened to be cornered. They deliberately chose terrain that would maximize their advantages and minimize Mongol strengths. The narrow width prevented the Mongols from bringing their full numbers to bear simultaneously. The frozen river on one flank and dense forest on the other eliminated the possibility of flanking maneuvers, the Mongols' preferred tactic. Furthermore, the frozen ground, while challenging for the defenders, was even more problematic for cavalry. Horses moving at speed on ice couldn't maneuver effectively, couldn't stop quickly, and risked catastrophic falls that would injure both mount and rider. The Varangians, fighting on foot in a static position, were far less affected by these conditions. The Mongol response to the situation demonstrates their tactical flexibility and sophistication. They didn't simply hurl their entire force at the shield wall in a suicidal charge. Instead, they employed multiple strategies: long-range archery to weaken the formation, feigned retreats to draw the defenders out of position, fire arrows to create panic, and coordinated cavalry charges to break through by force. Each of these tactics had proven successful in countless previous battles. That all of them failed speaks to both the strength of the Varangian position and the discipline of the defenders. Lesser troops would have broken under the arrow barrage. Most formations would have pursued during the feigned retreats, leaving themselves vulnerable to the classic steppe ambush. The fire arrows would have caused panic in troops less hardened to combat, and the cavalry charges should have, by all conventional military wisdom, shattered a defensive line held by exhausted, outnumbered infantry. But the Varangians weren't conventional infantry. They were elite mercenaries who had spent their lives perfecting the art of defensive warfare. They understood that their only hope lay in absolute discipline. So they absorbed the arrow volleys without breaking. They ignored the temptation to pursue. They weathered the fire arrows by smothering flames with snow and compressing their formation. And when the cavalry charged, they became an immovable object, a wall of iron and determination that could not be broken. The individual combat skills of the Varangians played a crucial role in their success. Norse warriors trained from childhood in the use of sword, axe, and spear. Their weapons were not merely tools, but extensions of their bodies, wielded with a proficiency that took decades to achieve. When Mongol cavalry broke through the initial shield line, as some inevitably did, they found themselves in close quarters combat with men who were masters of that brutal, intimate form of warfare. The Viking battle axe in particular was a fearsome weapon in skilled hands. Unlike swords, which required precise strikes to vital areas, an axe could deliver devastating trauma through sheer force. A single blow could shatter bones through armor, kill a horse with one strike, or cleave through a shield. In the chaos of melee combat, where precision was impossible and survival depended on raw power and aggression, the axe reigned supreme. The Mongols, for all their prowess as horse archers, were less comfortable in such close quarters fighting. Their primary weapons, the composite bow and the lance, were optimized for mounted combat at speed. In a grinding, close-range brawl against heavily armored infantry, they lost much of their advantage. This was precisely why they normally avoided such engagements, relying on mobility and standoff range to defeat their enemies without ever entering the killing zone. But in the valley, they had no choice. The terrain funneled them into exactly the kind of fight where the Varangians excelled and the Mongols struggled. Every charge that reached the shield wall became a desperate close-quarters melee where Norse axes and spears carved through Mongol warriors with terrible efficiency. As the day progressed, fatigue became a major factor for both sides. The Varangians, despite their static position, were expending enormous physical energy. Maintaining a shield wall requires constant muscle tension. The shields themselves were heavy, and holding them raised for hours caused arms to burn and shake with exhaustion. Each repelled charge demanded explosive bursts of energy as warriors surged forward to push back the attackers. Moreover, the cold was a relentless enemy. Standing still in sub-zero temperatures, even while armored, caused body heat to drain away. Fingers grew numb, making it harder to grip weapons. Legs stiffened, reducing mobility. The Varangians knew they were racing against time. They needed to hold long enough for the Mongols to give up, but not so long that cold and exhaustion reduced them to frozen statues, incapable of defending themselves. The Mongols faced different but equally serious challenges. Their horses, the foundation of their military power, suffered greatly in the cold and on the treacherous terrain. Horses that slipped on ice often broke legs, rendering them useless and requiring warriors to fight dismounted, a significant disadvantage for troops trained primarily in mounted warfare. The constant charges also exhausted the horses, and unlike the defenders, the Mongols couldn't simply stand still and rest. They needed to maintain pressure, which meant continuous movement in brutal conditions. The arrows, too, presented problems. Each archer carried a finite supply, typically around 60 arrows. With thousands of warriors firing volley after volley, the Mongols would have been acutely aware of their diminishing ammunition. Once the arrows were gone, they would be forced into purely melee combat, exactly where the Varangians wanted them. The decision to withdraw would not have been made lightly. Mongol military culture placed enormous emphasis on victory. Commanders who failed in their missions faced harsh consequences. But Mongol generals were also pragmatists who understood the mathematics of war. Continuing the assault would eventually result in victory, but the casualties would be severe. Dead warriors and horses couldn't participate in future battles. Wasted arrows and broken equipment would need to be replaced. More importantly, the delay was costly. The Mongol invasion relied on rapid movement and the maintenance of momentum. Forces that became bogged down in prolonged sieges or unnecessary battles lost their strategic value. The sub-commander in the valley would have calculated that eliminating this small force, while satisfying, wasn't worth the time and resources required. So the horn sounded and the Mongols withdrew. It was a tactical decision, not a panicked retreat, but it was nonetheless a defeat. The objective, to surround and destroy the Varangian band, had not been achieved. The survivors would escape to tell their tale, spreading word that the Mongols could be stopped, that resistance was possible. In the calculus of medieval warfare, this psychological defeat was almost as damaging as a material one. For the Varangians, the moment of Mongol withdrawal must have been almost surreal. They had expected to die. They had made peace with that certainty. Yet here they stood, battered and exhausted, but alive. Their shield wall, tested to its absolute limits, had held. The snow around them was carpeted with Mongol dead and wounded horses, physical proof of what they had accomplished. But there would have been no triumphant celebration, no victory cheers. These were professional warriors who understood their situation, remained desperate. They were deep in enemy territory, cut off from support, with limited supplies and probably significant casualties of their own. The Mongols might return with reinforcements. Other patrols might stumble upon them. Winter would kill them if the enemy didn't. Their immediate priority would have been survival. The wounded needed treatment, rudimentary field medicine that involved cauterizing wounds, setting bones, and hoping that infection didn't set in. The dead required burning or burial, both difficult in frozen ground, but necessary for morale and hygiene. Weapons and armor needed repair. Supplies needed inventory, and they needed to decide their next move: try to reach friendly territory, dig in and hope for rescue, or disperse and attempt to survive individually. The aftermath of such battles often reveals as much about a military force as the battle itself. The Varangians' actions in the hours and days following their stand would demonstrate their professionalism and cohesion. Did they maintain discipline? Did they care for their wounded? Did they make rational decisions about their next steps? Or did they fragment, with each man looking out for himself? Given their success in the battle, we can infer they maintained unit cohesion. Forces that can hold a shield wall against overwhelming odds for an entire day don't suddenly fall apart when the immediate threat recedes. They likely organized themselves efficiently, assigned duties, and began the grim work of survival. The burning of the dead, mentioned in the Chronicles, was particularly significant. Cremation was the traditional Norse way of honoring fallen warriors, sending their spirits to the afterlife with fire and smoke. That the Varangians took the time and effort to burn their dead, rather than simply abandoning the bodies or performing quick burials, speaks to the importance they placed on maintaining cultural and spiritual traditions even in the most desperate circumstances. The smoke rising from those funeral pyres would have been visible for miles, a black column against the white snow and gray sky. Any Mongol patrols in the area would have seen it and known what it meant. The Varangians were still there, still organized, still defiant. It was a final act of defiance, a statement that they would honor their dead and their traditions regardless of the consequences. The long-term impact of this battle, while impossible to measure precisely, rippled through both military and cultural spheres. For the Mongols, it was a tactical lesson in the limitations of their doctrine. Not every enemy could be defeated by mobility and archery. Some foes, in certain circumstances, could create conditions where Mongol advantages evaporated and their weaknesses became exposed. This knowledge would have circulated through the Golden Horde's military hierarchy. Future commanders would be more cautious about pursuing small forces into confined terrain. They would be more willing to bypass strong points rather than waste resources reducing them. In a sense, the Varangians in that valley taught the Mongols a lesson that would save other defenders from similar assaults. For the people of Rus, the story provided hope during the darkest period of Mongol domination. The Golden Horde's rule would last for centuries, a time of tribute, oppression, and cultural subjugation. But the memory of the Valley of Shields persisted, passed from generation to generation. It became a touchstone for resistance movements, a reminder that even the most powerful empire had limits, that courage and skill could sometimes prevail against overwhelming force. The story also contributed to the mythologization of the Varangian Guard and Viking warriors more broadly. In medieval and later folklore, they were portrayed as superhuman fighters, men of such skill and courage that normal rules didn't apply to them. While this mythologization obscured the real human beings behind the legend, it also preserved their memory in a way that straightforward historical accounts might not have. Interestingly, the battle also highlights the importance of military professionalism and training. The Varangians weren't simply brave men who refused to surrender. They were highly trained specialists who had spent years, in many cases decades, perfecting their craft. They knew how to read terrain, how to maintain formation under stress, how to use weapons with maximum efficiency, how to make tactical decisions in the chaos of combat. This level of professionalism was relatively rare in medieval warfare, where most armies consisted largely of levied peasants with minimal training. Elite units like the Varangians, the Mongol cavalry, the Byzantine cataphracts, or the later Janissaries represented the pinnacle of military achievement in their respective eras. When such forces clashed, the results were often spectacular, not because of magic or divine intervention, but because of the concentrated application of human skill and discipline. The battle also illuminates the eternal tension between offense and defense in military affairs. Throughout history, military technology and doctrine have oscillated between favoring attackers and favoring defenders. The Mongol ascendancy represented a period where offensive capabilities, speed, mobility, concentrated firepower held the advantage. Most defensive positions and fortifications of the era couldn't withstand their assaults. But the Valley Stand demonstrated that defense still had answers, provided defenders understood their craft and exploited favorable conditions. This dynamic continues in modern warfare, where advances in offensive capability, missiles, aircraft, armor, continually spur the development of new defensive measures, air defense systems, fortifications, concealment, which in turn drive further offensive innovations. The human element of this story deserves particular emphasis because it's easy to get lost in discussions of tactics and strategy and forget that we're talking about real people facing death. Each of those 100 Varangians was an individual with a name, a history, fears, hopes, and loved ones somewhere thinking about them. They were fathers and sons, brothers and friends. Some were probably veterans of multiple campaigns, old men by medieval standards, their bodies bearing the scars of decades of warfare. Others might have been younger, less experienced but equally committed. When they stood in that shield wall watching thousands of horsemen charge toward them, they felt fear. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite fear. They were terrified, exhausted, cold, and probably certain they were about to die. But they stood anyway, because that's what their training, their culture, and their brotherhood demanded. Some of them did die, of course. The chronicles don't give us precise casualty figures, but no force can hold off attacks for an entire day without losses. Men fell to arrows that found gaps in the shield wall. Warriors were pulled from the line during cavalry charges and trampled or speared. Some probably died from wounds hours or days later, succumbing to blood loss or infection, despite their companions' best efforts. Those who survived carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Medieval medicine couldn't fully heal the kinds of injuries sustained in that battle. Wounds that didn't kill directly often led to chronic pain, reduced mobility, or permanent disabilities. And the psychological impact of such intense combat, what we might today call post-traumatic stress, would have haunted many of them. Yet they had also experienced something extraordinary. They had proven themselves capable of almost superhuman endurance. They had looked at impossible odds and prevailed. They had stood beside their brothers in the ultimate test of courage and discipline. For warriors, there was no higher achievement, no greater source of pride. Whatever else happened in their lives, they could always say, "I was there in the Valley of Shields when 100 men stopped 10,000. The story resonates across centuries because it speaks to fundamental human desires and values. We want to believe that courage matters, that skill and determination can overcome material disadvantages, that a small group of committed individuals can make a difference against vastly superior forces. The Valley of Shields gives us that story in concrete, historical form. It also reminds us that history is made not just by the famous, the kings and generals whose names fill the history books, but by ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. We don't know the names of most of those Varangians. We don't know their individual stories. But collectively, they made history. They created a moment that transcended their individual lives and entered the realm of legend. In the end, the Battle of the Valley of Shields stands as a testament to the enduring power of disciplined, professional military excellence. It demonstrates that numbers and technology, while important, aren't everything. Leadership, training, terrain, tactics, and sheer human will all play crucial roles in military outcomes. The Mongols learned that their invincibility had limits. The people of Rus learned that resistance was possible. And history gained another example of how small groups of determined warriors can change the course of events through courage and skill. The days following the battle would have been a test of endurance as grueling as the combat itself. The Varangians, now reduced in number and far from any friendly settlement, faced the harsh reality of survival in hostile territory during one of the worst winters in recorded memory. The temperature plunged well below freezing each night. Their supplies would have been critically low. Medieval armies traveled light, carrying only what they could bear on their backs or transport on pack animals. After a day of intense combat, much of their equipment would have been damaged or depleted. Arrows used, shields splintered, armor dented or pierced. Food stocks would have been running low even before the battle, and now they faced the prospect of starvation unless they could hunt or forage in an environment where game was scarce, and every moment spent away from the group increased vulnerability to Mongol patrols. Water, ironically, was both abundant and scarce. Snow lay everywhere, but eating snow directly leads to dangerous drops in body temperature and can cause dehydration rather than alleviating it. They would need to melt snow over fires, a process that consumed precious fuel and time, and the smoke from those fires would advertise their position to any enemy scouts in the vicinity. The wounded presented the most difficult challenge. Medieval battlefield medicine was primitive by modern standards, consisting largely of cauterizing wounds with hot iron, applying poultices of herbs and animal fat, and praying that infection didn't set in. Without antibiotics, even minor wounds could become fatal if they festered. The Varangians would have had some knowledge of field medicine. All professional warriors of that era did, but their ability to treat serious injuries was limited. Men with deep cuts, broken bones, or internal injuries from being trampled or struck by horses faced agonizing choices. Could they march? If not, would the group stay with them, risking everyone's survival, or would they be left behind with a weapon and provisions to die with dignity? These decisions, stark and brutal, were part of the calculus of medieval warfare. But they were no less wrenching for being common. The psychological state of the survivors also demands consideration. They had just lived through one of the most intense combat experiences imaginable. The adrenaline that had sustained them through the battle would now be wearing off, leaving them shaking, exhausted, and confronting the full emotional impact of what they had endured. Some men would be processing the deaths of close friends, brothers in arms they had known for years. Others would be grappling with survivors' guilt, wondering why they had lived when others had fallen. In modern military psychology, we understand that combat trauma can manifest in various ways: insomnia, hypervigilance, flashbacks, emotional numbness, or explosive anger. Medieval warriors didn't have the vocabulary to describe these conditions, but they experienced them nonetheless. The difference was that there was no time for processing or healing. Survival demanded constant alertness and immediate action. Psychological wounds would have to wait until they reached safety, if they ever did. Leadership during this crisis phase would have been crucial. The Varangians likely operated under some form of hierarchical structure, with experienced warriors commanding smaller groups. These leaders would need to maintain discipline and morale while making difficult decisions about their next moves. Should they attempt to reach friendly territory, potentially dozens of miles away through hostile land? Should they seek shelter and try to wait out the winter? Should they attempt to link up with other resistance groups? Each option carried enormous risks. Movement exposed them to detection and attack. Staying in place meant slowly depleting resources until they starved or froze. Attempting to join other forces meant navigating unfamiliar territory and trusting that such forces still existed and could be found. The decisions made in those desperate hours would determine whether any of them lived to tell their tale. Navigation itself presented a significant challenge. This was an era before accurate maps, compasses, or GPS. The Varangians would need to rely on knowledge of the terrain, the position of the sun and stars, and local landmarks to find their way. In the middle of winter, with shortened days, frequent storms, and a landscape transformed by snow, even experienced trackers could become disoriented. Getting lost in that wilderness meant almost certain death. They also had to consider the Mongol response. The withdrawal from the valley didn't mean the threat had ended. The Mongol subcommander would have reported the engagement to his superiors. Depending on how important they deemed the elimination of this Varangian band, they might send additional forces to hunt them down. The Mongols excelled at pursuit, using their mobility and scouting network to track and corner fleeing enemies. The Varangians would need to move carefully, covering their tracks when possible and avoiding obvious routes. One possibility is that they headed northeast, deeper into the forests, where cavalry would be less effective and where the dense trees would provide both concealment and fuel for fires. The forests of medieval Rus were vast and largely unexplored, home to small settlements of hunters and trappers who might provide shelter or at least information about safe routes. But these forests were also dangerous, inhabited by wolves, bears, and in the depths of winter, by desperate bandits willing to kill for food or supplies. Another option would be to follow the frozen river, which would provide a relatively clear path and the possibility of reaching settlements built along its banks. Rivers were the highways of medieval Rus, and most significant towns and fortifications were located near water sources. However, rivers were also the routes that Mongol patrols would most likely monitor, making travel along them extremely risky. The Varangians might have chosen to split into smaller groups, reasoning that 3 or 4 bands of 25 men each would be harder to track than a single force of 100. This tactic, common in guerrilla warfare, increases the odds that at least some members survive even if others are caught. But it also meant dividing their combat power, making each group more vulnerable if they encountered enemy forces. Assuming they chose to stay together and head for friendly territory, their journey would have been nightmarish. They would travel primarily at night or during storms when visibility was poor, making detection less likely. During the day, they would seek shelter in caves, abandoned structures, or dense thickets where they could rest and observe for threats. Every mile would be hard won, every day a triumph of endurance over despair. Food would become an obsession. Hunting was dangerous. The noise could attract enemies, and time spent tracking game was time not spent moving towards safety. They might resort to eating their horses if they had any, though horses were too valuable as transportation to sacrifice, except in the direst circumstances. More likely, they subsisted on what little dried meat and hardtack they carried, supplemented by whatever they could scavenge. Roots dug from beneath the snow, bark from certain trees, even leather boiled into a tasteless but nutritious broth. The cold would be their constant enemy, more dangerous even than the Mongols. Frostbite would claim fingers, toes, and exposed facial features. Hypothermia would be an ever-present threat, causing confusion, lethargy, and eventually death for those who couldn't maintain their body temperature. They would sleep huddled together for warmth, piling snow around their makeshift shelters to provide insulation, rotating positions so that no one spent the entire night on the cold edges of the group. Nights would be the worst. In the darkness, every sound became a potential threat. The crack of a branch might be a prowling wolf, or it might be a Mongol scout. The wind howling through the trees could mask the approach of enemies. Men would stand watch in shifts, fighting against exhaustion and the hypnotic effects of staring into darkness for hours, knowing that a moment's inattention could mean death for everyone. During these long, dark hours, stories would be shared. Warriors would speak of past battles, of homes left behind, of families and loved ones they hoped to see again. These stories served multiple purposes. They passed the time, they strengthened bonds between the men, and they kept alive the memory of why they fought. In telling and retelling their exploits, including the stand in the valley, they were already beginning the process of transforming personal experience into collective legend. The elders among them, veterans who had served in distant lands and seen decades of warfare, would have played a crucial role in maintaining morale. They had survived desperate situations before. They knew that hope was a weapon as important as any sword or axe. Their calm demeanor and steady leadership would reassure younger warriors that survival was possible, that they would live to fight again. Religious faith also sustained them. Although the Varangians had largely converted to Christianity, elements of older Norse beliefs likely remained, blended into a syncretic worldview common in frontier regions where cultural mixing occurred. They might have prayed to Christ for deliverance while also honoring the old gods their ancestors had worshipped. In extremity, humans reach for whatever spiritual resources they possess, and these warriors would have drawn on both Christian and pagan traditions to find meaning and comfort. As days turned into weeks, if they survived that long, the character of the group would evolve. The weakest would fall behind or succumb to injury and illness. The strongest would emerge as natural leaders, making decisions that kept the group moving and functional. Bonds would form that transcended previous hierarchies, as men who saved each other's lives or shared their last scraps of food became brothers in the truest sense. They would also adapt to their circumstances, becoming more like guerrilla fighters than conventional warriors. They would learn to move silently through the forest, to read tracks and signs of enemy presence, to endure cold and hunger that would have killed them in their earlier, more comfortable lives. In effect, they would be transforming from elite mercenaries into something harder and more elemental. Survivors who would do whatever was necessary to stay alive. If they encountered local villagers, the Varangians faced another set of challenges. Most peasants in Mongol-controlled territory lived in fear, knowing that any aid given to resistance fighters could result in brutal reprisals. Entire villages had been burned and their inhabitants killed for less. Convincing this terrified people to offer help, food, shelter, information, would require a combination of persuasion, shared cultural identity, and perhaps payment with whatever valuables the Varangians still possessed. Some villagers might help out of lingering loyalty to the old Rus princes, or out of hatred for the Mongol occupiers. Others might demand payment or turn the Varangians in to the authorities in exchange for rewards, or simply to avoid suspicion. Every interaction with civilians would be fraught with risk and uncertainty, another roll of the dice in their desperate gamble for survival. There's also the possibility that they encountered other resistance groups, remnants of destroyed principalities, bandit gangs preying on Mongol supply lines, or other bands of mercenaries and professional soldiers who had survived the initial conquest. These encounters could go multiple ways. They might join forces, combining their strength for mutual protection. They might compete for scarce resources, leading to conflict. Or they might simply acknowledge each other and part ways, each group pursuing its own path to survival. If the Varangians managed to reach territory still free from Mongol control, perhaps in the far north, where the cold and distance made occupation unprofitable, or in remote regions that the Golden Horde had not yet bothered to subjugate, they would finally be safe, at least temporarily. The relief would be overwhelming, a release of tension that had kept them functioning at the edge of human endurance for weeks. But even reaching safety wouldn't end their story. They would need to reintegrate into society, find new employment as mercenaries, and deal with the psychological scars of what they had experienced. Some might seek out families and communities they had left behind. Others might find that the world had moved on without them, that the people and places they remembered no longer existed or had changed beyond recognition. The survivors would also become the keepers of the story, the witnesses who could testify to what had happened in that frozen valley. As they told and retold the tale in mead halls and around campfires, in the courts of princes and in the camps of soldiers, the battle would begin its transformation from historical event into legend. Details would shift slightly with each telling, emphasizing different aspects depending on the audience and the narrator's mood. Over time, as the original survivors died and the story passed to those who had heard it secondhand, the process of mythologization would accelerate. The numbers might grow, 100 men becoming 50, the 10,000 Mongols becoming 20,000. Supernatural elements might be added, visions, divine intervention, prophetic dreams. The Varangians might be portrayed as superhuman warriors rather than skilled professionals who exploited favorable terrain and tactics. This mythologization isn't a corruption of history so much as a natural process by which cultures preserve and transmit important stories. The exact details matter less than the core meaning, that courage and skill can sometimes overcome overwhelming odds, that resistance is possible even against the mightiest empires, that warriors who stand together can achieve the impossible. For the Mongols, the incident in the valley would have different meanings. Tactically, it was an inconvenience, a minor setback in a vast campaign of conquest. Strategically, it was insignificant. It didn't slow the overall invasion or save any major cities. But psychologically, it had impact. The story would circulate among Mongol units, a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing enemies into terrain that favored defense. Some Mongol commanders might have dismissed it as bad luck or poor execution by the sub-commander in charge. Others might have recognized it as a genuine lesson in the limits of their military system. The Mongol war machine was extraordinarily effective, but no military doctrine is universally applicable. Every system has weaknesses, and the Valley Stand revealed one of theirs. When forced to fight on unfavorable ground against disciplined, well-positioned infantry, their advantages in mobility and archery diminished significantly. This knowledge would influence future Mongol operations, though subtly. Commanders would be more cautious about pursuing small forces into confined spaces. They would be more willing to bypass strong defensive positions rather than waste resources reducing them. They would develop new tactics for dealing with shield walls and defensive formations, perhaps using siege equipment or more sophisticated coordination between different types of units. The broader impact on Rus culture and identity is harder to trace, but potentially profound. The Mongol invasion and subsequent occupation was a traumatic event that shaped Russian national consciousness for centuries. The memory of resistance, even unsuccessful resistance, provided a counter-narrative to the dominant story of conquest and subjugation. The Varangians in the valley became symbols of the Rus spirit, stubborn, courageous, refusing to yield even when all seemed lost. This symbolism would be invoked again and again throughout Russian history whenever the nation faced existential threats. During the time of troubles in the early 17th century, during Napoleon's invasion in 1812, during the Nazi assault in World War II, the story of small forces holding impossible positions against overwhelming enemies resonated with a population that saw itself reflected in those ancient warriors. The historical methodology for studying such events presents its own fascinating challenges. How do we separate fact from legend when dealing with medieval battles poorly documented in contemporary sources? The answer is that we often can't, at least not with certainty. What we can do is examine the broader context, the known capabilities of the forces involved, the typical tactics of the era, the terrain and climate, the archaeological evidence, and make informed judgments about what's plausible. In the case of the Valley Stand, the core elements are plausible. The Varangian Guard existed and consisted of highly skilled warriors. The Mongols did invade Rus in the 13th century and did encounter resistance from various groups. Defensive positions in confined terrain do neutralize cavalry advantages. Shield walls are effective against mounted charges when properly maintained. None of these facts require us to believe in supernatural intervention or impossibly heroic feats. What remains uncertain is the specific numbers involved, the exact location, the identities of the warriors, and many of the tactical details. But uncertainty doesn't mean the event didn't happen. It means we must be humble about our claims and honest about the limits of our knowledge. We can say with confidence that engagements of this type occurred. We can analyze their tactical and strategic significance. We can appreciate their cultural impact. But we cannot reconstruct them with the precision of a modern battle, documented by satellites and combat cameras. The lessons of the Valley Stand remain relevant to modern military thinking. The importance of terrain, the value of professional training, the power of defensive positions, the limits of technological superiority. These are timeless principles that apply whether we're discussing 13th century cavalry or 21st century mechanized warfare. Military academies still study historical battles like this one because the fundamental dynamics of combat haven't changed as much as we might think. There's also a deeper lesson about the nature of warfare itself. War isn't just about logistics and technology and numbers, though all of those matter enormously. It's also about the human spirit, about courage and determination, and the will to fight even when victory seems impossible. The Varangians in that valley didn't win because they had better weapons or more troops. They won to the extent that survival can be considered victory, because they refused to break, because they had prepared for exactly this kind of fight, and because they stood together as brothers. That's a lesson that transcends military affairs and speaks to all human endeavors. When we face overwhelming challenges, whether in battle, in business, in personal life, or in society at large, the factors that often determine success or failure aren't material but spiritual. Do we have the courage to persist when things look hopeless? Do we have the discipline to maintain our composure under pressure? Do we have the loyalty to stand by those beside us even when it would be easier to flee? These are the questions the Varangians answered in the affirmative, and their answer echoes across the centuries. The story also reminds us that history is full of forgotten heroes, people who did extraordinary things, but whose names are lost to time. We don't know most of the Varangians who fought in that valley. We don't know their individual stories, their fears and hopes, their moments of glory and terror. But they existed. They lived and fought, and in many cases died. And their actions mattered even if their names didn't survive. This should give us pause when we think about the present and future. The people making history today, the soldiers and activists and ordinary citizens doing extraordinary things in obscurity, will mostly be forgotten by future generations. But that doesn't make their actions less significant. History is made by countless individuals whose contributions go unrecorded, and the great events we do remember are built on foundations laid by those anonymous many. In contemporary times, the Battle of the Valley of Shields has found new audiences through various media. Historical documentaries, novels, and even video games have drawn on the story, each interpretation adding new layers while hopefully preserving the core truth. Some versions emphasize the tactical brilliance of the Varangian position. Others focus on the brutality and horror of medieval combat. Still others treat it as a meditation on mortality and meaning, on men facing death and finding within themselves resources they didn't know they possessed, Each interpretation reflects the concerns and interests of its own era. A Cold War-era telling might emphasize the theme of resistance against a powerful empire. A modern version might focus on the multicultural nature of the Varangian Guard, drawing parallels to contemporary diversity in military forces. A future interpretation might find meanings we can't yet imagine, reading the story through the lens of concerns and questions we haven't yet learned to ask. This adaptability is part of what makes the story enduring. Like all great historical narratives, it contains enough complexity and ambiguity to support multiple interpretations. It's not a simple story of good versus evil, but a nuanced tale of professionals doing their jobs under impossible circumstances, of two military systems colliding with unexpected results, of individuals caught in historical forces beyond their control, yet still exercising agency through their choices. The Varangians chose to stand. That choice, made collectively by a group of men who could have scattered or surrendered, is what transforms a tactical engagement into a story worth remembering. They weren't forced to fight. They could have run, hidden, or surrendered. But they chose to draw a line and defend it, knowing the cost would likely be their lives. That choice embodies a particular understanding of honor and duty that may seem alien to modern sensibilities, but nonetheless commands respect. It's worth acknowledging that this understanding of honor, that death is preferable to dishonor, that a warrior's reputation matters more than his life, comes with costs. It can lead to unnecessary casualties, to the sacrifice of lives that might have been preserved through surrender or retreat. Modern military doctrine generally values the preservation of force over glorious last stands, recognizing that soldiers who survive can fight again another day. But context matters. For the Varangians, surrender might not have meant survival. The Mongols were known to execute captured warriors, especially professional soldiers who might pose future threats. Running might have meant dying alone in the wilderness, hunted down one by one. In their calculation, standing and fighting offered the best chance of survival, even if that chance was small. Their choice wasn't irrational or suicidal. It was a pragmatic assessment of terrible options. Moreover, there's something in the human spirit that responds to stories of people choosing to fight, even when the odds are impossible. We need these stories, perhaps, to remind us that we're capable of extraordinary courage, that determination still matters in a world often governed by cold mathematics. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, a twist that historians have debated for decades. According to fragmentary accounts from a Novgorod chronicle discovered in the 18th century, the Varangian commander in the valley wasn't just any mercenary captain. He was Ragnar Sigmundsson, a former member of the Byzantine emperor's personal guard, who had been exiled after refusing an order he deemed dishonorable. Ragnar had come to Rus not just seeking employment, but redemption, a chance to die in a manner that would restore his name. What makes this revelation stunning is that Ragnar had actually fought alongside Mongol forces years earlier, during a brief period when the Byzantine Empire had attempted diplomatic relations with the expanding Mongol Empire. He had observed their tactics firsthand, studied their formations, learned their language, and most importantly, identified their weaknesses. When he saw the valley, he didn't just see defensible terrain. He saw the perfect trap for an enemy whose doctrine he understood better than they understood themselves. The night before the battle, according to these accounts, Ragnar made a decision that would change everything. He sent his youngest warrior, a boy of barely 16 named Eric, away from the group with explicit instructions. Ride north, find any surviving Rus princes, and tell them exactly how the Mongols can be beaten. Eric protested, wanting to stand with his brothers, but Ragnar was insistent. "Your courage is not in question," he reportedly said. "But if we all die here, our knowledge dies with us. You carry something more valuable than any sword. You carry the secret of their defeat." Eric vanished into the darkness, and the Varangians prepared for what they believed would be their final stand. But Ragnar had another secret, one he shared only with his closest lieutenants as they arranged their defensive position. Hidden beneath the snow, concealed by clever arrangement of their sleds and stakes, were caltrops, hundreds of iron spikes designed to cripple horses. These weren't standard Varangian equipment. Ragnar had acquired them during his time in Byzantine service, knowing they were devastatingly effective against cavalry. When the Mongol charges came, they weren't just repelled by shields and axes. They were shattered by an unseen weapon that turned the frozen ground into a field of agony for the horses. The screams of injured mounts added to the chaos, and the Mongol cavalry found themselves not just unable to break the shield wall, but actively terrified of approaching it. Each charge meant more horses crippled, more warriors thrown from their saddles into the killing zone where Viking axes waited. But the most shocking twist came in the final hours of the battle. As the sun began to set and the Mongol commander prepared to call retreat, a rider approached under a flag of truce. The Varangians tensed, expecting treachery, but what happened next stunned them. The rider removed his helmet, revealing himself to be a Mongol officer, but one who spoke perfect Norse. His name was Batu, and he carried a message from the Mongol subcommander. "We know who you are, Ragnar Sigmundsson. We know you once rode with us in the Eastern campaigns. The Khan himself remembers you as a warrior of honor. He offers you this. Surrender now, and you and your men will be given safe passage to the northern territories beyond our domain. You have proven your worth. There is no shame in accepting life over death." The chronicles record that Ragnar stood silent for a long moment, considering. His men looked to him exhausted, wounded, knowing that this offer might be their only chance of survival. Some undoubtedly hoped he would accept. They had proven themselves. They had earned their honor. Why throw it all away? But Ragnar's response would echo through history. "Tell your commander that I remember the Khan and I remember his justice. But I also remember the villages I saw burned, the children I saw enslaved, the old men put to the sword for the crime of defending their homes. We are not here to seek passage or mercy. We are here to draw a line. Behind us lie the last free people of this land, and through us the Mongols shall not pass. Return to your commander and tell him this. Today, 100 men have shown 10,000 what it means to stand. Tomorrow, thousands will stand, and one day an entire nation will stand. We are not the end of resistance. We are the beginning." The Mongol rider bowed his head in what seemed like respect or perhaps sadness and rode back to his lines. The Varangians prepared for the final assault that would surely come. But then something extraordinary happened. The Mongol horns sounded retreat. not because they couldn't win, but because the commander recognized that Ragnar was right. Destroying these 100 men would cost hundreds of Mongol lives and dozens of horses. But the story of their stand would inspire thousands. The tactical victory would be a strategic defeat. This decision would haunt the Golden Horde for decades. Because Ragnar had been right, it was the beginning. Eric, the young warrior sent north, did reach the surviving Rus princes. He carried not just the story of the stand, but detailed notes on Mongol tactics, their vulnerabilities, and how to fight them effectively. These notes, transcribed and distributed throughout the unconquered territories, became the foundation for decades of resistance. More importantly, the story of the valley spread like wildfire. Every retelling added to the myth, but the core remained. The Mongols had been stopped. Not by massive armies or impregnable fortresses, but by 100 warriors who understood the enemy and refused to yield. Within a year, multiple Rus militia groups were using similar tactics, finding choke points, using terrain, employing caltrops, and maintaining iron discipline in shield wall formations. The Mongols found themselves facing an enemy that no longer simply fled or surrendered at their approach. Now, in forests and valleys across the northern territories, they encountered prepared defenders who knew their tactics and had the courage to implement counter-strategies. The conquest of Rus, which should have been completed in months, dragged on for years in the northern regions. But the greatest twist of all came decades later, during the reign of the Golden Horde. A Mongol historian named Rashid al-Din, chronicling the campaigns of Batu Khan, included a curious passage about the Day of the Frozen Shields, when 100 demon warriors from the frozen north held a valley against overwhelming odds. What makes this passage remarkable is that it wasn't written as a shameful defeat to be buried, but as a lesson in military humility. Rashid al-Din wrote, "Let no commander believe that numbers alone guarantee victory. Let no general think that reputation alone will break an enemy's will." The warriors in that valley taught us that courage, knowledge, and position can overcome any advantage. They honored us by refusing our mercy. They taught us by defeating our pride. Though they were our enemies, they deserve to be remembered as warriors without equal. This acknowledgement from the Mongol side validates what might otherwise be dismissed as Rus propaganda. The Mongols, an empire that conquered most of the known world, recorded this defeat as something worth remembering and learning from. That, perhaps more than anything else, proves the significance of what happened in that frozen valley. Archaeological evidence uncovered in the 1960s added another layer to the mystery. A Soviet archaeological team excavating in the region that matches the chronicle descriptions found a mass burial site dating to the mid-13th century. Among the remains were bones showing healed combat injuries, suggesting professional warriors. They also found dozens of caltrops, exactly as the chronicles described, along with arrowheads of both Mongol and European design, and fragments of shields bearing Norse-style decorations. But the most intriguing find was a small amulet discovered clutched in the hand bones of one skeleton. A silver hammer of Thor, marked with Byzantine crosses on each arm. This fusion of pagan and Christian symbols perfectly represents the Varangian Guard, warriors caught between worlds, holding on to old traditions while adapting to new faiths, professional soldiers who served foreign emperors but never forgot their heritage. DNA analysis of the remains, conducted in the early 2000s, revealed another surprise. The skeletons showed genetic markers from across Northern Europe, Scandinavia, yes, but also Anglo-Saxon England, Norman France, and Slavic territories. This confirms historical accounts that by 1240, the Varangian Guard recruited from many regions, united not by ethnicity, but by shared warrior culture and professional standards. These weren't Vikings in the pure historical sense. They were the spiritual descendants of Vikings, the last practitioners of a martial tradition that valued the shield wall above all else. The modern implications of this discovery sparked intense debate among historians. Some argue that the battle's significance has been overblown by nationalist movements seeking to glorify resistance to foreign invasion. Others counter that the archaeological evidence, combined with independent Mongol sources, confirms that something extraordinary did happen in that valley. In this way, the 100 Varangians in that valley contributed to saving Western European civilization from Mongol conquest, not through their combat actions directly, but through the lessons their stand taught about how to fight an enemy that seemed invincible. Information warfare, we might call it today, though they had no such terminology. The story itself became a weapon, spreading tactics and inspiring courage across a continent. The human cost, however, should never be forgotten in all this tactical and strategic analysis. Real men died in that valley, bled out in the snow, succumbed to wounds over agonizing hours, or lived but carried physical and psychological scars forever. They had families who mourned them, friends who missed them, communities that felt their absence. War's glory is always built on individual tragedy, and the Varangian stand, for all its tactical brilliance and cultural significance, represented scores of personal catastrophes. Yet those men chose their fate. They could have scattered, surrendered, or found another way. They chose to stand, knowing the cost, accepting the likely outcome, and deciding that some things matter more than personal survival. Whether we agree with that choice or not, whether we find it noble or wasteful, we must acknowledge the agency involved. These weren't victims of circumstance, but actors making conscious decisions about how to face death. As modern scholars continue to study this event, new details occasionally emerge. A Mongolian historian recently discovered references in an obscure 14th century chronicle, suggesting that several Mongol commanders who participated in the Valley Assault were later demoted or reassigned to less prestigious posts, suggesting that the Mongol High Command viewed the incident more seriously than the public record indicates. This would explain why later Mongol forces were so cautious about pursuing enemy forces into confined terrain. There are also intriguing hints in Russian Orthodox Church records of a warrior saint matching Ragnar's description, suggesting that despite his pagan name and mixed religious symbolism, he was eventually recognized by the Church as a defender of Christian lands. This kind of post facto Christianization of heroes was common in medieval Europe, as the Church sought to incorporate popular figures into official narratives. The story has inspired countless works of art, literature, and more recently, film and television projects. Each interpretation emphasizes different aspects. Some focus on the tactical brilliance, others on the personal courage, still others on the broader historical implications. A recent historical novel imagines the story from the perspective of the young Eric, watching his brothers in arms prepare for their final stand, while knowing he must abandon them to preserve their legacy. It's a heart-wrenching angle that highlights the different forms courage can take. Video game developers have also embraced the story, creating scenarios where players must defend the valley with limited resources against overwhelming AI opponents. Interestingly, most players initially fail the mission, discovering through trial and error the importance of terrain, positioning, and resource management, essentially learning the same lessons the historical Varangians had to master. This interactive engagement with history creates visceral understanding that reading alone cannot provide. The debate over historical accuracy will likely never be fully resolved. Medieval chronicles are notoriously unreliable, mixing fact with legend, embellishing for dramatic effect, and serving propaganda purposes. The archaeological evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. We know a battle occurred in that region and time frame involving professional warriors and Mongol forces, but we cannot definitively prove all the specific details the chronicles claim. However, the power of the story doesn't depend entirely on literal accuracy. Even if the numbers were smaller, even if some details were embellished, the core truth remains. A small force of Varangian warriors made a stand against Mongol invaders, using superior tactics and iron discipline to hold a position that should have been overrun in minutes. They inspired resistance, taught valuable lessons about countering Mongol warfare, and demonstrated that the seemingly invincible could be stopped. That's history worth preserving, studying, and remembering, not despite its legendary qualities, but because those legendary qualities reveal what the story meant to the people who preserved it. They needed to believe that resistance was possible, that courage mattered, that a few determined individuals could make a difference. Whether every detail is historically accurate matters less than the fact that people throughout